Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the next episode, episode 2 of the Panjwai podcast. I'm Luke Coffey,
I'm Curtis Grace.
and we're glad you're joining back with us again to begin the next step in telling the story of our 2012 deployment to Panjwai, Afghanistan. So, last time, if you're following on with that first episode, we talked a lot about the background of Panjwai. We talked a lot about the kind of fighting that we did, the IEDs. We talked about Sparrow and Gar a little bit, and we gave you a kind of brief personal history of how we ended up there. And so we ended off by segueing into the topic of today's episode, which is that first firefight. Uh, you know, for the infantrymen, that first firefight is an important event for obvious reasons. And it's something that really sticks with you, and you really think about it a lot as you progress through your deployment, but also as you progress through life. And it's kind of a monumental moment in a man's life. Wouldn't you agree, Curtis?
Yeah, well, I don't know about every man's life, uh, but but certainly from the moment you get to infantry OSIT, like you're bred to look for that first firefight to earn that CIB, and we were having a conversation the other day about the difference between a cab and a CIB, and how fundamentally, sorry, my fellow 11 Bravos, there's no difference. It's the same award, but we wear it differently because the infantryman trains for that. That is all they want, to earn their CIB, to validate their MOS and their purpose in life. That's all they care about. But as a former Pogue who earned their cab, it was like ancillary to my job. Like I was stoked to go into combat, and I already had a CIB, so maybe that made it a little bit different, but it was different. It wasn't like achieving a cab was the purpose of me being that job. Whereas to be a to have a combat infantry badge as an infantryman, like that's your purpose, and you went through all of
Yeah.
your basic training and stuff, envious of the people that had them.
Yeah, for sure. And it's something that when you're a fresh private showing up at a unit, it's definitely something that you want because all the senior guys, at least when we were going in, all the senior guys had it. And I imagine there's guys now who are probably 10 years into a career that don't have one, which is pretty wild to think about. But yeah, I mean, you show up to the unit and that's the thing you want, that coveted combat infantryman's badge. It's what you cut your teeth by. Of course, on the back end of our experiences, you realize that just because somebody has a cab or has a CIB doesn't necessarily mean that they were in the thick of it. But it's one of those things where the military, of all the stuff that, and I'm not the kind of guy who likes to wear his military service on his shoulder, even though I know we're doing a podcast about it, which I'm sure people who know me well are probably kind of surprised by this, by me turning out to do this. I know Curtis is probably having a good laugh at my expense on that behalf.
Oh yeah.
But the one thing that I earned in the military, the one medal or the one ribbon or whatever that was given to me that I really felt like I earned was my CIB, and I'm actually proud of the CIB for sure, because we didn't get ours from a mortar landing 300 meters outside of our cop.
No, and I think that's one of the more like toxic things in the whole veteran community is oh well,
Hmm.
you got this and it was bullshit, or you got that and it was bullshit, or cab isn't the same as a CIB, and you have to, there's different rules for them, or whatever. It's just the bickering back and forth that it gets. But at the end of the day, like, you know what you deserved, you know what you earned, and I know the people that I served with, what they earned and what they
Hmm.
deserved, and everybody on April 25th, 2012 earned their CIB.
Yeah, and everybody on April 5th, 2012, earned their cabs, our
That's
medics and
true.
our 13
Hmm.
Foxtrots, and even one of our mechanics was out there with us on this patrol, Sergeant Orball.
Was he?
Uh,
That's right, he was. I forgot
Yep,
about
because
that.
he wanted to get his cab, and we were almost guaranteed to take contact. So he came with us to get his cab, and he ended up picking hell of a fight to participate in.
Little did he know he'd take a freaking RPG to a bulldozer 6 months later.
Yeah, right. Shout out to the man. He was a good dude. We liked
Yep.
him.
Yep.
So last time we discussed this mythos of the 2-8 grid line. We kind of gave everybody a brief background on that. It was essentially the line in the sand that the unit we replaced warned us about. That was their magical line. That as soon as they crossed that line, they would get into some contact. They'd start getting into Taliban country. And so naturally, our first thing we wanted to do was go over there and kick the hornet's nest a little bit.
Well, naturally, the first thing Captain Kitching wanted to do was go over and kick the hornet's
Yes.
nest.
Yes. Captain Kitching wanted to go over and kick the hornet's nest, and so as we mentioned before, he actually came on this patrol with us. He
He
did,
did,
right?
yeah, he did. That was one
Okay,
of, like, the
yeah.
warning signs.
hmm I wasn't anywhere around him during the fight, so I couldn't quite remember. So yeah, we had this kind of weird little patrol. This is the first longer patrol we did. Up to that point, we had essentially done little foot patrols, kind of making semicircles to the east. We haven't quite gone far enough to find that special little tree line where where the Taliban would always shoot at us. We did one patrol where I think they tried to maneuver on us, and we had ISR on station, and they were like, "You're getting pushed on and maneuvered on," but we managed to get out of there before they started shooting. So, yeah, what were we doing on this mission, man? Because my memory's not super clear on the
So
details.
we were going to scout the location for a mountaintop or hilltop OP on a little scrag of a rock called Zangabadgar. Um,
Hmm.
Whereas like Spurwangar was a fake hill that was built by the Russians, and Mazamgar was a natural mountain essentially. Zangbadgar was just like this little spine that popped out of the middle of the valley, kind of out of place to be honest, but definitely natural. And they
Hmm.
wanted us to go and see how feasible it would be to put an OP up there. And I'm not sure why they didn't just have one of the 800 aircraft that were flying over every day take a look at it and tell them what was obvious, which was that no, no, you couldn't. There's nothing up there. It
Right.
was like a razor edge
uh,
spine of a rock.
hmm
But I think probably the purpose really was just to go get in a gunfight.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So we struck out. We mentioned again. We'll reiterate here. We struck out west on what was affectionately known as the Taliban Highway, and it was this car-wide dirt road. There's a picture of it on Instagram. If you guys want to go check it out, where it leads out the west side of Sperwangar. And we walked along that road, and we this is before we learned the lesson of don't take the roads. And so we moved out. We left out good and early that morning, and we just started walking, and we walked for a good while. I mean, I want to say it was 4 or 5 clicks.
Yeah, I mean, if memory serves correctly, Spurwangar sits on like the 3-1 or 3-2 grid line. I have to go back and look. Um,
Hmm.
it was at least 2 clicks on the road,
Yeah.
and it was slow moving because we did have the mine detecting equipment. We were, I think at that time we still had the Afghans walking up front. That was before they decided they didn't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
Um, so Afghans were leading. We had mine detecting equipment. We were fast because we were taking the roads, but we were slow because we didn't know what we were doing.
Yeah. We had only been there a couple 3 weeks actually on
Yeah,
the cop itself, and we had just ripped out with the other unit, so they had just gone. Like the last of those guys had just left, maybe a few days before we launched this
yeah,
patrol. So there were a few walking into this thing. There were a few signs that are kind of staples when you're fighting an insurgency. One is the lack of civilians. When you move into a village, or you're walking along and you start to notice there's no kids out playing, or there's no people just going about their daily lives, that's a big red flag, and that kind of makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, because it's this eerie ambiance in that you're in a place where you can see like people are doing stuff. There's cooking pans laying out, or maybe even like the bedroll from that night hadn't been stowed away, and so it's like a ghost town
yeah.
essentially. And so that's a big warning sign for shit's about to go down.
Yeah, and to kind of paint the picture about this road that we were walking down, to the south, it was almost unobstructed to the mountains. Wide open fields,
Hmm.
mostly. You didn't have the grape rows, there wasn't a lot of trees. But to the north, it was heavily vegetated. We basically walked alongside a canal the entire time. And on the other side of the canal was your grape rows, your agricultural areas, your villages, your clots, all the kind of stuff we talked about in the last episode was across this
Hmm.
canal. So we're kind of like we were walking on the outskirts of town, and we should have seen people. We should have seen people in the fields. We should have seen
Yeah.
people just across the canal or driving back and forth on motorcycles. Like it's a heavily used road, which is part of why we felt comfortable taking it. Which, even in hindsight, probably wasn't smart.
Yeah, and that's something we kind of learned in the long run. Is like, if it's something that's really heavily used by the Taliban for one, but also the civilian population, you could more or less walk on it in relative safety. Just don't step to the sides and through gaps, you
Yeah.
know. But we still avoided those routes because they were just natural points of ambush for the Taliban as well. Leading up to this story, um, people need to understand that we never got the one up on the Taliban because because of how the terrain worked and because of how they were able to spot us, maneuver around us, we pretty much got ambushed every single time. And even when we would try to ambush them, you try to get the one up on them, we usually weren't very successful. There's only a couple times where we actually like stumbled into some Taliban, and that was just by happenstance.
Yeah, I mean, there were a few times we surprised them, but I don't think we ever successfully, like, fired the first shot in anger.
No, and I think we surprised them this day. And surprise usually worked to our advantage because instead of being able to lay in a really intricate ambush, which we walked into a few of those throughout the deployment, they had to kind of scramble together and whip together a quick plan. And so it usually made for a less intricate ambush, but it's still, they would still get the one up. It was always that first opening round, a salvo of PKM or AK fire. A lot of times PKM, I feel like they opened up.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, that was a good weapon. I mean, because once we got to cover, they weren't gonna be able to continue to use that weapon effectively. They basically had one chance to hit us with that weapon. Then
Hmm.
it was better for them to use those lightweight AKs that they could maneuver around with us on.
Yeah. So, we were walking along the Taliban highway and we began to notice on the horizon kites. And one of the things, there's two things that we had been kind of briefed on by the previous unit. In retrospect, what's your opinion on this, Curtis? Because in retrospect, I kind of wonder the validity of it. Was it just people out playing? I think sometimes it was kids just out playing with kites, and maybe sometimes they actually used them to signal our general area.
Yeah, and it's hard to say. On this
Yeah,
day, I'm thinking it was probably a signaling device because they were kites in the middle of
yeah, I think
towns, and
so.
like no one flies a kite in the middle of like a town. You generally go to parks, you go to wide open spaces for that kind of thing. And they were flying inside Pimaluk, which we'll probably post some
Yeah,
pictures of that in the future. But it was a pretty dense
it was.
Kalat. It was one of the bigger Kalats right outside the gate. So for them to be flying kites there, it just didn't seem normal. But definitely later in the
Yeah.
deployment, we would get people saying, "Oh, they're flying kites." We're like, "Yeah, I know they are." There's like 4 6-year-olds standing in a field flying a kite. That feels pretty normal to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. And another thing they would do, and this is something we encountered on our first patrol, when we made a kind of a semicircle to the east, is the men would come out on the roof and shoo up the pigeons. They would have these
Hmm.
pigeons all over their roofs. And so they'd come out and shoo up the pigeons, and they would fly up, and that was kind of used as a signaling device to tell, to kind of talk people onto our general area.
Which I think is hilarious because this wasn't back in 1945. They have cell phones.
they, yeah, they had cell phones, they had icon and
Yeah.
stuff.
So I agree. I think probably
Uh,
a part of that was signaling, but probably the majority of it was people attaching that to thinking they were signaling. Because we intercepted enough enemy comms and cell phones and stuff like that to know that they were using that kind of thing. They weren't always trying to use like archaic modes of communication, but we can't rule out that they were.
So, we're pushing west. Nobody's out there. It's hot. This is April 25th, and it was already up into the
Yeah, it was a
90s.
warm day.
During the day, it was almost getting up to that 100-degree range. And so, Curtis and I were actually in very different parts of the formation on this. We had already been briefed to walk in a file, so we weren't trying to walk in a wedge. We weren't trying to do any kind of formation. We were just walking in our file. And my fire team and the A&A guys that were around us, and we had one of the military working dog handlers with us, a dude named Dwayne Jones, and then another fella, Chris Royball, was in the back with
Yep,
y'all. So we actually had two dog handlers out
which
with
was
us,
unusual.
and it was unusual, yeah. And so we were pushing up, and we took a long halt. We took a big long pause. I can't remember why.
I think it was a map check because I think we were
Okay.
approaching the point of the patrol where we were going to have to turn north, and we were starting to look for
Mm-hmm.
a good point to cross that canal.
Mm-hmm. And it was around this time that the A&A really started to get kind of sketched out.
Yeah, at the back where I was, we had a trailing element of Afghan National Army soldiers. And
Mhm,
like we said, it was pretty sparsely populated. So I think it was second or third back in the American file. We started hearing the ANA making a ruckus. They're yelling. Looking back, like what's going. I think I was back with Sergeant Ott. I think he was back there with us,
mhm,
and we don't have an interpreter with us, so we're not 100% sure what's going on. We just hear them yelling, uh, and then we hear a single gunshot, just one, which was very clearly from one of the M16s of the Afghan National Army soldiers. So we hear the
yeah,
gunshot. The interpreter runs back, talks to them. He said, "Yeah, somebody ran across the road, and they told him to stop, and they didn't listen, so they fired a warning shot." Like, okay, weird, but you
sure.
know, we would come to find out that whether it be negligent discharges or warning shots, the ANA fired random single shots on patrols a lot.
Yeah, they did. And so, yeah, we took this long halt, and I remember vividly is I was in a bad spot because the leading element up in front of us, the rest of my fire team, was already to like a series of these pillars. They're kind of odd looking. I think what it was is it was an old wall that had just kind of fallen down, and so there's about 3 or 4 of these pillars that were probably 2 to 4 feet wide, and they were just kind of staggered along the side of the road, and so they were all kind of up there in that general area. And then I looked behind me, and I could see the foremost person in the rear element, and I was kind of caught between the two. And I was remember looking around, and I thought, man, like I'm in the wide open here, and I had this instinct, this guttural instinct. And for folks who haven't had these experiences, always trust your gut. And so my instinct was to pop a squat. And so I did. I didn't even get down on my knees. I literally squatted on the heels of my feet. And the second, I wouldn't say the second, but as soon as I popped a squat, I kind of hunkered down. And I would say just a few seconds later, the fucking PKM just opened up right on us, and that kicked off this firefight. So, um, I knew I was in the open. I knew I was in a bad spot, and so I had this instinct to just run and get to cover, which is probably our training kicking in. And so I hauled ass to those pillars where the rest of the fire team was at. And by that point, everybody was trying to get some fire on, and I got up there, and there's one of the guys in the unit. If you can trust what he has to say, he claims that there were rounds kicking up around my feet. I didn't hear any rounds going over my head, but I honestly think it was probably just the dust from my boots
Yeah.
kicking up where I was hauling ass. And so I get up there, get behind that first pillar, and I pivot, and I'm starting to try and find that enemy fighting position. And for those of you who have been in these places where they use those mud walls, there's a very distinctive shape when a machine gun or a weapon is laid up on top of a wall. And that muzzle, the pressure from that muzzle blast will kick up a really distinctive V shape. And so I remember I turned on my hill and I saw that V shape, and I put my ACOG on it and just started squeezing rounds. Man, I probably squeezed off 10 or 15 rounds, and I think that fairly successfully suppressed the enemy. And I'm sure other people were shooting at that, up at that fighting position too. And I know for sure there's PKM that opened up on us, and then there was an AK. I think there's 2 guys in that firing position.
Yeah. I mean, towards the back, we just had the PKM that was shooting at us. And when I say
Hmm.
shooting at us, in hindsight, think about all the other engagements we had on that deployment, it wasn't directly at us because there's very
Hmm.
distinctive sounds when a bullet goes by you, and the more the more times you get shot at, the better you get at figuring out how close they are. There's a scene in
Hmm.
Black Hawk Down where they're sitting on the corner and they're getting shot at, and the ranger tells his buddy, he's like, "No, no, no! Like it's, bang means it's far, and a zip means it's close, or what?" I can't remember the line, but there are differences, like, and it all has to do with
Hmm.
that bullet breaking the sound barrier and how close it is to your face.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Also, when the bullet passes a certain point and it's no longer moving supersonic and it starts to tumble, it makes kind of like a zzz sound. So anyway, the point is, I wasn't hearing those snaps and cracks and zzz, so I knew in hindsight they weren't directly firing at our position in the back.
I think if they were shooting at me, I mean, it kind of makes sense because I was running across open space, but I'm not going to sit here and say that they were. But I think one of the things that really saved me is that just to my right there was a small wall about 3 foot tall, and so when I popped a squat, I don't doubt that I popped out of that guy's line of sight because that PKM would have kind of been back and to my
Yeah.
right when it kicked off. So yeah. So what did you guys do after that first contact? You just start shooting at anything that moved, or?
So, I mean, it was such a foreign thing to us. We didn't really know what was happening. So we'd heard that
Mm-hmm.
warning shot, and then we heard that incoming fire, which, if you've never been shot at, you expect incoming fire to sound very different, like it is in the movies. But it's different because now
Mm-hmm.
you're not hearing the sound of the gun go off first. You're hearing the sound of the bullets going past you first, and it's really kind of it throws
Yeah.
your brain off. So we didn't know what was going on, and then
Yeah.
like we had this kind of conflict in training. Like Luke mentioned, he ran to cover because that was like the core of his infantry training. But we had just gone through all this counter IED training that said, don't do that. So
Yeah.
like I'm standing in the middle of the road and we take fire. So I just like drop down to the ground. And I'm like, oh crap, I'm in the middle of nowhere. So I pop back up. I was like, oh shit, they can see me. So I popped right back down and took a knee. And I was like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And right in front of us, there was like this mound of dirt. And everyone started to run towards that. So I ran up to that mound of dirt it was with Perez and I can't remember who else was there. Sergeant Rosal or
Mhm.
Specialist Rosales at the time was there.
Mhm.
So we went up to that. I basically like put my front leg up on the dirt pile, and so I could get up on it a little bit, get my muzzle clear, and I fired, probably a magazine at that V that you were
Yeah.
talking about because we could see that against that wall. So
Yeah.
we shot at that V. Uh, I think I dumped an entire mag, and then
Yeah.
I dropped down and cover because at that point we could kind of figure
Yeah.
we weren't being directly fired at, so we just kind of took our positions. And then once we were no longer shooting anymore, we could hear that you guys were. We could hear the front of the element still in a gunfight, but we weren't in a gunfight anymore. And Perez next to me just is like, "Dude, we just got our CIBs." Like in the middle of a gunfight, like we could get killed at any moment, of course. And like this guy's over here, just like cheesing, biggest grin on his face ever, just stoked because he just earned his
Uh,
CIB, and that's all he cared about.
yeah, and that says a lot
It
about it
does.
right there. Lil Perez, he was a machine. We loved
Yep,
him. He's a great little dude. We might be able to get him
I think
on the
so.
horn at some
Juan
point.
Rambo.
Yeah. Juan Rambo, yeah, he was affectionately called Juan Rambo for his habit to literally just dump every single round out of his saw the second
Oh
we
yeah,
took
and it was
contact,
awesome.
which
Yeah,
was
yeah,
good.
made it
Yeah.
better for him. He didn't have to carry as much for ammo back.
So one of the things that when I look back on this firefight that I realized worked to our advantage was our inexperience. Because the next evolution of this firefight at the time when it was just going on up front where we started getting hit really hard is I didn't realize just how bad it was. Because it turned into a real shit show up front. And so Curtis was talking about the sounds that bullets make when they fly past your head, but there's also a very distinguishable sound of a bullet making an impact on a hard surface close to you. And I think the closest thing that I can think of is if you're on a construction site and you're framing up a house and you take a sheet of OSB board and you just like drop it from the first floor onto some flooring, like some OSB board or plywood, whatever people use, and that if it lands really good and
Hmm.
flat, you get that really distinctive smack. It's like a smaller version of that sound. and and so, like I said, we suppressed this position, and then I remember I tucking in real close behind that pillar and reloading, getting my new mag in, my fresh mag up, and then I just started kind of scanning around, and what happened was to my right was Jones, and Jones, our new Navy dog handler, was in the prone. And if my memory serves me correctly, I should have asked him this today, but I forgot to. He actually saw two dudes come into an alleyway. And it's also important that we point out how rare it was to actually see the Taliban. If you were lucky, you would see that V. That was pretty good. If you could find that fighting position, then you could do some work. But for the most part, we never saw them because, they were so good at using fighting positions. They were so good at hitting and running and changing and moving all the time that it was hard to get eyes on.
Well, and the whole AO is basically a freaking a trench network.
Yeah, exactly. So they could pop up, squeeze off a couple of rounds, and move on, move 15, 20 meters down the road and do the same thing. And so Dwayne saw these two Taliban fighters come out, and they started spraying at us with AK. And it was at that moment they started getting that smack, 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 smack. That crack of the bullets hitting the wall around us. And like I said, in experience, I didn't know at the time that the bullets were just like, I mean, I heard it obviously, but that sensory experience and that adrenaline rush, it wasn't quite registering that those were bullets impacting the walls
Yeah.
around us and the pillars and everything. And so I remember Dwayne, he was in the prone and he had his M4, he had the buttstock of his M4 tucked up underneath his arm. He's pushing himself. His dog is freaking out, understandably so. And he's just like shooting as quick as he can while pushing himself in the prone back to cover. And he's going shit, 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 shit. And so we just started shooting around. And I think that kind of simmered down just a little bit, just for a second or two. And then I started kind of scoping out with my ACOG. And there was this building, and it was a 2-story mud hut. It was probably about 50, 55 meters from the pillars, maybe a little bit more, 60 meters. I would say 50, actually, 50 to 55 meters. And so I'm scanning the roof of this thing, and I just happened to see this guy. So there was a doorway to the second floor, and there was like this big mud doorway, and it was like a black hole. And I would just happen to see this movement. And we will kind of unpolitically correct them. It's not very PC, but we'll call them what we called them at the time in the jargon, a man dress. So these like white or gray or brown or green, ankle length robes these men would wear. We called them man dress because we used them as a descriptor. So 300 meters out there's a military age male in a green man dress, and it helps everybody kind of orient themselves. So I see the swirl of this white man dress. I remember a black turban and a black beard. And I saw an AK-47, and I don't know what this guy was thinking, man. He must have thought he was John Rambo or something, because he comes out not quite shooting from the hip, but also not really getting up on behind the gun either. He's just kind of starting to get it into the action. And so I put my ACOG center mass, and I remember I fired 7 times. It was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and those last 2 rounds actually hit the frame of the doorway, and I saw the dust kick up from those, and I saw this guy kind of like fall back, and that AK just fell straight down to the floor. And so that was pretty crazy because it's really hard. Like I said, we barely saw the Taliban, and it's definitely really hard to get some good shots in on an actual person. So that was, when I look back on it now, I realize how fortunate, is that the right word?
Rare. How rare it was.
Rare, yeah, how rare it was to actually have that experience in our AO. And so this guy, he's out of commission, and then we are kind of scanning around. The firefight kind of simmers down, and one more dude, we actually saw this guy too on the far end of that compound. He pops his head up, and by that point, everybody was honed in on the compound. Sergeant Baker, he was lobbing 203. I was trying to talk. I told him I just hit that guy in the doorway. I said, "Put a 203 in that doorway." And so he's lobbing the 40 mic, and he's overshooting the building, so it's like landing behind it, which honestly might have worked out pretty good because I'm sure they were hauling ass out of there, the rest of the guys that were there. And so, yeah, we saw this, black turban, black beard pop up, and he tried to get his gun up, but everybody was onto him at that point, and everybody started, shooting at this dude. And he ducked back down and was gone. We didn't see him again. And that kind of simmered it down. And so the rear unit started pushing up to us. We kind of
Oh,
linked
you're
up.
missing the most important part
And
of this
then,
firefight, man.
oh, yeah, that's right. So that's what's going on up
Oh.
front after the initial rounds from the PKM. What's going on in back there?
So right around the time you're talking about when it calmed down and the shooting kind of slowed down and stopped, uh, Lieutenant Chris Persons at the time decided this was a good time to run Battle Drill 1 Alpha, which is where one element, which is under fire, maintains contact with the enemy, while the other one flanks around. You've heard that term in a movie, I'm sure. Flanks around
Mhm.
and tries to catch them with their pants down. But remember, I mentioned earlier, there's a canal running parallel to the road, so we have to get across this canal. At the time, and for like 6 months, I was the clearing guy, so I had the mine detector. I had a spare one in my bag. Pulled it out. And Lieutenant Person's like, all right, we're going to got to cross this canal and we're going to run battle drill one out. We're going to flank him. And I was like, hell yeah, sir. We're going to do this. I got the mine detector out. Walk up to the canal. I look at it. It is so deep and it's wide. It's running fast. I'm like, sir, that looks pretty deep. He's like, doesn't matter. We got to cross it. I'm like, all right, let's do it. And I just jumped. And no one expected me to just jump in. They were like, okay, he was going to crawl in or something. No, no. I was super stoked. Adrenaline's high. I'm freaking king of the world. I'm going to lead this charge and I'm going to kill the Taliban myself. I'm 5'8" on a good day.
Yeah.
I went straight under, straight down, straight
Yeah.
under the water. It was like 6 feet deep.
I'd have paid money to see it.
And
I'd have paid money to see it.
I'm 6 foot deep. I'm wearing a backpack. I have an AT-4 strapped to my backpack. I weigh 150 pounds more than I did without clothes on. Like it was, I went straight to the bottom like a freaking blob.
Mhm.
And then I came up. I was like, oh fuck, I'm not tall enough for this shit. So
Mhm.
I then tried to swim back to the shore, or actually, I tried to grab reeds on the side. Which, if you've ever been caught in like a fast current, the worst thing you can do is try to hold on to something that's not in the water, because the current's going to
Mhm.
sweep your feet out from under you and put your head under the water, which is what happened. So I was like, okay, that's a bad idea. So I'm like starting to like drift down the stream here, and I'm like, oh, I got to get to the side of at least get to the side of the river everybody else is on. So I get to the other
Mhm.
side, and I'm trying to like grab up and climb these things, and one of our soldiers, who was a little bit taller than me, jumped in. He jumped in and he made sure I didn't, go down the stream and kept my head above water and helped me get to that side of the canal. At which point, Chris Royball, while his dog Bella was trying to bite everything in sight, um, pulled me. I think they used a mine detector to kind of pull me over to the bank, and then like three guys helped pull me out, and then pulled the other soldier out too. Uh,
Yeah.
so we quickly abandoned Battle Drill 1 Alpha at that point.
Battle Drill 1 Alpha.
And so that was the point where we're like, okay, we're not going to do that. The firefight's over. And that's when we reconsolidated with you guys. And I just took up like a security position on a corner of a building or whatever. And that's when they started to bring out those casualties.
They started bringing out the casualties, which was just one guy. But this kid came out. He was probably about 13 or 14. And in his wheelbarrow, he has a grown man in a white man dress with a black beard. And by that point, his turban had been knocked off. And this kid, very deftly, I was actually really impressed by his agility. He had the full grown man in a wheelbarrow, and he pushed him across essentially like an 8-inch log across this canal, and brought him to us. And he had been shot in the arm and the stomach. I've often wondered if that was the guy in the doorway. I don't know. I'll never know, and that's fine. Um, but yeah, we administered aid. Medevac came and picked him up, and he died on the way to CAF, I think.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the weird part about that whole experience was we had this really intense firefight, and then we went into a security posture for quite a while the medics treated that guy. They called in a medevac bird, and they took him away. So I mean, that's probably another hour of us just sitting there before we moved.
Yeah, the medevac took a long time to get there too,
Yeah,
because it wasn't a priority.
no, I mean, and that's it's one of the weirder things about the war at that time was the fact that we were medevacing out, enemy soldiers, which Geneva Convention requires us to render aid. But I'm no expert on the Geneva Convention. I'm pretty sure it doesn't require us to medevac enemy soldiers to the rear like that. Air medevac is supposed to be for urgent surgical and like urgent medical conditions. And a civilian I would get, but I mean, we knew this guy wasn't a civilian. So, but I guess it's just one of the things that makes us different than them is that we did render that kind of care when possible. And it was possible there. I mean, there was a clear HLZ. It wasn't like had to hump his body, 20 clicks to get him out of there. There was an HLZ right there. And at this point, I'm still sitting in that security posture. I'm soaked. Like my gun is covered in mud. I'm like trying to like using a stick to try to make make a channel through the barrel so that if I do have to fire it again, that it will be fine. And as I'm messing with that, like just a million things running through my mind. Like I just about died in my first firefight, and it had nothing to do with being shot at. Um, so my adrenaline is through the roof just from this near death experience that was basically just drowning. That could have happened, in Pensacola. But as I'm like contemplating this and like you starting to get out of the game. It's like, you're on patrol, you're on alert, you're fighting, you're in the game, like you're totally focused, and then you start to like fall out of like focus, and like once you start to do that retrospection, like you're kind of not in it. And what snapped me out was Lieutenant Persons came up. He's like, "Hey man, you doing all right?" I was like, "Yeah, Roger that, sir. I'm good." He's like, "Okay, good. Here." And he holds out a mine detector. He's like, "You're gonna clear the rest of the way." I was like, "Oh, great, thanks." So he hands me that, and I clear across that little bridge you were talking about, cleared up to the entrance of the building that they had been shooting at us from. And at that point, I think they sent in the dog. The dog cleared the rest of the building. And then it was our fire team took up security on the north end of the building, looking to the north, while your squad cleared the compound with the dog teams and leadership and stuff like that. So I think it was only like 4 or 5 of us out on that north end, just kind of sitting there. And while you guys were in there, our squad leader decides now's a good time to take a piss, which kind of violates the rules of combat because everybody knows as
Absolutely.
soon as you decide you're going to go to the bathroom, that's when the enemy's going to decide to
Oh,
shoot at you.
oh,
When
dude,
you,
I almost got shot taking a whiz one time.
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the
I
story
think
for
a
another
bunch of
day.
people have almost gotten shot trying to
Yeah.
take a whiz. I know Phillips for sure almost
Yeah.
got domed trying to take a whiz.
Yeah.
So he goes to take a piss, and immediately, we take fire. But it's only 4 of us. Everyone else is inside the building, so no one else is in a position to actually return fire.
Mm,
Uh, but I am, and like 2 other people are. So we sprayed. Like they were from the north. We knew generally where they were, but we didn't have that telltale V this time.
mm,
There was a grape hut and a canal to our north, and they were firing from the grape hut. So we just lit up that grape hut.
yeah.
But since I had a I had cover that I'd already established, and I knew where they were, and there was no one else around. I think I dumped like 2 mags in just that
Nice.
one little thing.
Yeah, good work.
I didn't need to. I could have fired
Yeah.
2 rounds. It would have been fine. It would have scared them off just as bad, but it was cool
Yeah.
to actually get magged out in combat.
Should
Like,
we, have we covered what Grapehuts are for the people who aren't familiar?
no, it was actually one of the things we did not cover in our intro episode, which I thought was a little bit of a rob of our
Yeah.
listeners. So we'll go ahead and talk about that. Luke, tell us about a grape hut.
So Grapehut is a bunker. Period.
Yeah, but what's its intended purpose?
A Grapehut is a structure that the locals would build, and it was a mud hut just like everything else there, but it had these slots in it that were kind of alternating, and they were in rows from the floor to the ceiling of these things, and they would alternate. And when it come time to harvest the grapes, the locals would hang the grapes over some sticks that were stuck in these slots to dry for processing or whatever they do with them. And so the walls on these things were a couple of feet thick. I mean, and they had all these little slots in them, and so they were essentially, and there's one way in, one or no. Usually they would be a door in both ends, and they'd be pretty tall. They might be 10 or 15 feet tall. Really thick mud walls, easy to defend, and a natural firing position because you could shoot from those little slots,
Hmm.
and nobody'd ever be able to get you. So we got hit from the grape putts a lot, and we weren't really able to do much with them other than suppress them unless you could get birds on station until we actually got the Carl Gustav, which is a beautiful weapon platform, and we'll talk more about it later. But essentially, it allowed us to actually punch through those walls and those grape huts with an exploding 84 millimeter anti tank round. So
Well, yeah, and that's at this time we were only carrying laws, which is a very light anti-tank weapon, hence the name LAW, and AT4s, which was supposed to be a more powerful anti-tank rocket. And our experiences with using both of those against the Grape Huts early in deployment was a total failure. They didn't even make a dent. They maybe made a scorch mark on it. I mean, you're talking like the walls of these things are like 18 inches to 2 feet thick. Like these weren't. If you could like pour, you know, rebar enforced concrete that was a foot and a half thick, that's about the strength of these things.
yeah, they were gnarly.
But at the same time, you could walk up to it and like if you dug long enough for an hour, you could probably dig a hole through one. It's just really weird.
They were strange. I think because the dirt and the mud that they were made out of was so dry and hard that it made for this really concretey natural barrier. Yeah, so they made natural fighting positions, and the Taliban used them, and actually we used them for a few patrol bases along the way as well. When we do these larger clearing operations and stuff.
I mean,
Um,
I've slept in them. I've climbed on top of them and shot people from them. I've been shot at
mhm.
from them. Like, I've used them as cover,
Yeah.
like, and it's kinda crazy we forgot to mention them in our orientation episode because they're probably 50% of all of the buildings
Yeah.
in Panjwai were these Grapehuts. You had the Kalots, which were the villages, and you had the fields and the walls, but other than those, it was just a grape hut, and
Mhm.
you had to have these so that they could dry their grapes.
Yeah.
So they were everywhere.
And another reason they were good fighting positions for the Taliban is because they were on the outskirts of town, so they could shoot out from town. Take a little jaunt down the street, jump into a grape hut. We'd be out there in the fields, and they could open up on us from these things.
Yep, and there's usually so it's like a rectangular structure, and there's a door on either end. So that gives them if they engage us from one end out the door, they can escape out the back, and we can't do anything about it because they've always got that second exit.
Yeah, for sure. So we started pushing north. Y'all took a little bit of contact. It wasn't too bad, if my memory serves me correctly,
No, no, no. We definitely reacted with an excessive amount of disproportionate force.
which is good. That's what we were trained to
Love it.
do.
We don't fight fair.
Yeah, and so we started pushing out of there to get back to the trucks, which were up just were they on Hyena?
They were on Hyena. Yep. So we
Yeah.
had about a I want to say 3-click walk north,
Mm.
give or take.
Yeah, so we started pushing out of there, and we got to the trucks, and it was this like sense of relief,
Hmm.
but also simultaneously, when we got into the trucks, is we were beginning to crash from the adrenaline rush, and so the adrenaline that hits your system, I mean, it's like mainlining the stuff, and it's essentially you get high, really, because all the endorphins and the dopamines and stuff that are kicking off in your system, it sends your body into this really crazy state. And I've never done anything since, and I'm not really an adrenaline junkie, so I have never like skydived or anything, but I've never done anything since that has reached that same level of adrenaline high that you get in combat.
Yeah, and we would experience this to like an extreme degree the next time we got into a gunfight, um, which was in Jarendai, a little bit further to the west, as part of a kind of a recon operation. And what made that one worse was when we took contact, we ended up bounding backwards over open ground, which was something we didn't do very often in Panjwai. There wasn't a whole lot of open ground, but in this case, we had to because we were pinned down in the open. We had to bound backwards over a couple hundred meters of open ground. So you'd have one fire team coming back and taking up a position and shooting at this village while the other fire team is running past them to get to the next position. And it was, just this constant moving for, 10, 15 minutes until we got back into some grape rows and some cover. And it just, you, like you said, it's like mainlining something. You're just like mainlining adrenaline.
Yeah.
And you are faster. You move without any kind of worry about your fitness or fatigue, physical capabilities. You just do what you need to do because your life is on the line. But
Mhm.
then once that threat goes away and your body kind of is like, okay, bro, time to relax. You're like,
You
it'd be like if
crash.
you, yeah, you just crash because it'd be
Yeah.
like, hey, did you know that you could run a 4-minute mile? Because you just did, and now your legs are falling off.
Yeah. And I remember after that first firefight, as we started to get closer to the trucks, and my body began to kind of like realize I was relatively, I was starting to get to that point of safety. I remember my legs and my muscles just like seizing up on me, like
Hmm.
painfully. Like my leg muscles were fucking wrecked. And I just remember thinking, like, man, what the hell's wrong with me? Like, why am I so smoked out? I was having a hard time. I was sucking. My legs were hurting. And then, for some reason, it just didn't dawn on me until that second firefight when we had to move across that open ground and that same crash happened. I was like, dude, of course it's the adrenaline dump. Like your body is trying to recuperate from this massive dump of adrenaline.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting about this adrenaline rush is that the more time you spend in combat and the more combat you see, by the end of the deployment, you almost like just like any actually not even by the end, just a few months in, you almost just like any other substance that we abuse, alcohol or whatever, you you learn to manage the high, if you will. And so you actually become better at controlling this dump so that you don't have that crash. And so you can essentially ride it out and come out in the back end and still be physically able to continue your mission and continue pushing.
Well, and towards the end also, we stop. You get to the point where you're no longer reacting with panic or like reflex, and you're not running and you're not like jumping and doing all these crazy things. You you have the maturity and the experience at that point to be like, okay, I'm being shot at. I'm okay. There's no need to climb this grape wall and like, be Juan Rambo. I can just stay where I am. And I can move slowly from cover to cover. And if I need to move quickly, I just do it for a brief moment. And you don't physically overexert yourself in these situations so that when that adrenaline does purge, you didn't do some physical feat while you were high on adrenaline that your body can't compensate for.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think you grow into it in a way.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then
For
I
sure.
think when you get to that point, it's a different kind of it's the experience is different. Like the way you experience a firefight, the way that you experience combat is a completely different sensation.
I'm sure we talked to some soft guys or regiment guys that have been in many, 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 many firefights. They'd say, yeah, the first like 5 or 6, that was totally a thing. But by the end, I just kind of got to the point where it didn't affect me as much, and
Yeah.
you just you get you like you said, you get used to it. You get
Yeah.
used to that dose of adrenaline, and it probably takes a more significant event, which is why a lot of guys do become adrenaline junkies because over time, like they no longer get the adrenaline from that particular act. They have to step it up so that they can
Hmm.
feel like that again.
And I think this is might be a little bit controversial of an opinion to state, but and I think a lot of like medals that get handed out can be owed to that on some level.
Yeah,
That next adrenaline rush. It's like the thing that you're doing to push the boundaries of what you can do in that space. Usually that's when people start getting awards slapped on them.
yeah, for better or worse. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, for better, for worse.
yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'm wrong in that. Maybe that's just a personal conjecture, but
Well, I'm saying I think there's a lot that plays into those kind of situations. I think one, you can't discount courage or bravery
yeah,
at
for
all.
sure. Hmm.
But I have the pretty controversial opinion myself that you can't be brave or courageous if you're not fucking terrified. If you aren't
Yeah,
fucking terrified, then whatever you're doing is just instinct or it's training. It's not
yeah,
courage. And in hindsight, it's really courageous and it's really brave. But at the time, a lot of people are just like, no, I just did what I had to do. And a lot of these guys that
mm,
receive these big awards, Medal of Honor and stuff, they'll tell you, I just did what I had to do. I wasn't
yeah,
thinking about how dangerous it was or anything like that. And it doesn't make the act itself any less impressive. Um, but I feel like for someone to truly be courageous and brave, they have to have that thought in their mind, like, what I'm about to do is dangerous. And I'm a little scared, but I'm going to do it anyway because it has to be done.
yeah. And when you talk about that fear and that kind of terror that one feels in these moments, and that doesn't necessarily, and I think this is what gets misinterpreted a lot too. And this is something we'll probably spend more time on and go into more detail on later on. But you also have that fear and concern for someone else. This is one of your buddies whose life and livelihood you care about. So when these really brave or courageous things happen, it might be just a kind of a transference of that fear. It's like I'm not really concerned for my own life or my own
Right.
well being right now, but I'm
I'm
really concerned about his.
right.
Um,
And in those cases, that would force me to eat my words that I just said. And it is courageous and is because
yeah,
you are fearful for him. You
yeah,
don't want your buddy to be hurt or to die or he's out there.
yeah.
Uh, there's a great shot of images. It's not video, but it might be video actually. But it's Marines in Fallujah,
Hmm.
and one guy goes down in the middle of the street. Like it just drops like a rock. You know he's dead. And
Yeah,
then the medic runs out after him into this firefight, open street, against every single doctrine or training that he's supposed to have. Because that guy's probably dead. If he's not dead, he's
yeah,
going to be because they're just going to keep shooting at his body.
yeah.
Medic runs out, medic gets shot. Done, down, dead, immediately drops. And I think one more person goes out after this medic. And if you look up the video, you'll know because the medic's wearing a big black backpack.
Yeah,
And then
I think
another
I've seen
guy
that.
goes out and he gets shot. And we were
Yeah.
shown this video in basic training. We were shown it in the pre-deployment. Like, hey, do not do this because
Hmm.
one casualty just turned into three.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And it's a weird game that you play whenever these occasions arise. a firefight or especially IED strike. It's this weird game between your natural instinct of self-preservation, you're managing the fear, and you're beginning to control and regulate that adrenaline high so that you can ride it out so it carries you further.
Mhm.
And while also like deeply caring about what's happening to the guys around you.
Right.
And especially when you're there for longer periods of time and you have all these experiences together, and that bond begins to strengthen, then when something does happen to those guys, you're this individuality of self-concern kind of falls to the wayside, and it becomes more of a group think kind of thing.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Yeah.
or am I waxing too philosophical
Nah, you're
here?
probably waxing a little bit philosophical, but you're not wrong. I think, and this is going to come up a lot. There's going to be a lot of times, Clark, Perez, Dennison, not so much on Perez. Perez just, he just got rocked. Love you, Perez. Um, but a lot of circumstances where that instinctual reaction, that brotherly love, that desire to help, uh, hurt guys too. So and so I think that topic is definitely going to come back up. That whole, uh, you know, brotherly love, self-sacrifice kind of thing.
Yeah, it's incredibly complex, and I think that our natural our natural instinct as people is to see things in a binary. And when you're on the back end of an incredibly complex situation, then you start to apply labels so that it makes sense.
Hmm.
So the complexities behind a courageous act isn't just as simple as somebody having the balls to go out and drag his buddy to cover, or whatever the situation is. It's more complex than that. It's just that in the backwash of all that, there's a system that tries to make sense of it, and that kind of, maybe, I don't want to say depreciates, but it labels those complexities in some ways.
Yeah. So I mean that more or less wraps up the story of our first firefight.
It does.
Um, and it took a good bit longer to get through it than I thought it would, to be completely honest. So, uh, what I'd like to go into now is a brief discussion with Luke about some of his personal experiences, and I think after that, he's probably going to return the favor.
Yeah.
So, to our astute watchers of the video version of the podcast, you'll notice we're wearing different clothes because it took us about 2 weeks to get back to finishing this episode. Um, but we really felt it was important to give you a more personal idea of who we are and what our experiences meant to us. Because in the upcoming interviews and episodes, we're going to spend a lot of time talking to other people that we worked with and served with, and other people that served in the area. And it's going to be a lot of them talking. Um, so this will be kind of your last chance to get to know Luke and I and our experiences for quite a while.
Yeah, I feel like anytime that our piece of the puzzle is being brought up later on, it's going to be in a natural conjunction with what somebody else is saying. And obviously, the further outside of our immediate platoon or squad that we get, the less and less that Curtis and I can contribute. So, it's just an opportunity for us to kind of get some base work down so that everybody can see where we're at, and then we can go from there.
So kind of driving off of that, Luke, this was not your first deployment,
Right.
um, but this was your first introduction to combat. Was this deployment the first time you encountered an IED at all? I mean, had you seen them in Iraq or anything before? What was your exposure to the IED threat before?
So, in Iraq, our op tempo was actually pretty damn crazy. It was almost as high as it was in Afghanistan. It's about the same, actually. But we were going out every night doing counter IED operations, and we did it for months and months and months, during the middle of our deployment, especially. And so, during the course of those nightly operations, we busted a couple guys. The platoon did. I actually wasn't out there that night. They busted like a small cell of guys trying to put an ID in the ground. And then our platoon didn't experience any kind of crazy interactions with them. There's some suspected IEDs. You call up EOD they'd be hours getting there, and then they would just either blow it or just declare nothing that's a big threat or anything. We did unfortunately lose two very fine soldiers to an IED strike. That was Lieutenant Robert Collins and Specialist Anthony Blunt. And that was just a bad situation with some villagers that let an IED maker in place, about a 200-pound IED that went off under their MRAP, and killed Blunt almost immediately from what I heard, and then Collins died on the medevac out. So, but yeah, that was pretty much it, and there was a VBID that went off on the Cav platoon right outside the gate in Mosul, and we were actually on the way back from a mission when those guys got hit. But so that was, all of my IED experience to that point was proximal, because the actual combat when we were in Iraq was really basically non-existent, almost in the entire country.
So that means, I guess, that your first exposure to an IED or that degree of combat was Afghanistan 2012.
I mean, I didn't even earn my CIB in Iraq. So
yeah,
and we went into it knowing that would be the case.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess then, if you follow the same question, what was your first real exposure to combat in 2012? Was it the firefight we just talked about, or were there other? Did you hit any IEDs on patrols, or find IEDs on patrols, or anything like that?
I remember earlier patrols finding IEDs. Fortunately, nobody had hit any by then.
Sure.
So that first firefight was definitely my first, real introduction to combat, and it was a proper introduction for sure. But as far as IED threat, like we mentioned already a little bit, it took a while for us through a very unfortunate series of trial and error to figure out how to navigate that whole sphere of our fight. And we had been on patrols where we'd found them. I remember one patrol up north. I can't remember which village it was in, but it was the last major village on the west side of Route Brown before it got to Hyena. And
yeah, that was just north of Dorsey.
Yeah,
if I remember correctly, just south of that ANCOP checkpoint.
Mm-hmm. And the dogs hit a bunch of IEDs. Like the dogs actually sniffed out a handful that day. So
that's probably like a daisy chain, at
yeah,
right outside of the burial area, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was a daisy chain. I think there's like 3 or 4, maybe 5 in there.
Yeah.
And so that was probably my first, at least from my memory, that was my first proper interaction. But my first real encounter with the IED was when the engineers got hit. We were walking in to link up with the rest of the platoon to walk them back to the patrol base that night. And I was about 15 or 20 meters from their foremost element when they stepped on that IED. And so I kind of watched all this unfold from a few meters away while I was pulling security, because they had, the whole squad basically treating those guys. So, my job was to turn the pivot and pull security, because we had heard about these IED initiated ambushes, and we were all kind of waiting for that to kick off.
Well, and I feel like that aspect of the fight in Panjwai meant that there were a lot of incidents similar to that I was around for but didn't fully participate in or experience, because you just couldn't. We were walking in a file, so you're 30 people back, or there's a high ID threat, so you can't really move. So even firefights that happened to our platoon or squad that I didn't participate in, because it was happening in a place where I couldn't participate. It wasn't even affecting me. And that's how long our formations was, that you could have firefights that would affect a portion of the element, and the other one be totally fine, totally safe.
Yeah, and I tell people all the time, when we have these conversations, I don't tell them all the time because I don't really talk about this stuff very openly.
Yeah.
But when I'm talking about it with someone, I describe to them, like, in combat, especially the kind of combat we saw, just a few feet can completely change your experience. If I had been 10 meters closer to the engineers, I probably would have gotten knocked on my ass and got caught in the dust cloud, And like when it first went off, I thought Sarnaut was hit, because all I could see was his. I was watching him, and then he got blown on his ass, and I could see his arm kind of hanging out of the smoke cloud and the dust cloud with his weapon, and I had that feeling, like, oh shit, Sarnaut's hit, So it was a big IED,
Yeah.
for sure. But yeah, just a few feet or even a couple meters can mean the difference of like getting riddled with bullets and being relatively safe behind the cover of a mud wall. So it's just chance encounters. A lot of it, so much of it is left up to chance.
I mean, that's true for a huge percentage of our deployment
Hmm.
because, that inches or feet makes a difference. Like, we literally marked a path everywhere we walked with spray paint that you stayed inside the lines and you were safe. But if you went 6 inches or a foot outside the line, like you're no man's land. And we
Yeah,
had an NCO in another platoon that stepped outside the lines and lost his leg.
yeah,
So we're literally playing a game of inches
yeah,
to cross these huge paths of
yeah.
ground and to try and effectively patrol an area that didn't want us there.
So what was, I mean, for you? What was your first proper, real introduction to IEDs? Do you remember?
It was so I had the privilege and the pleasure of being trained as one of our first counter IED guys. And I ended up doing that job for almost the entire deployment, which sucked. But in the beginning days, we were real gung ho about it. So they not only did they train me on the mine detector, which at that time was just a metal detector. We didn't have the Minehound or Chia yet.
Hmm.
Um, which at the time seemed simple. You sweep for metal. If it barks metal at you, you stop. What I didn't know was that the ground was full of fucking metal. It was just all metal. It was like decades of Soviet, American, British,
Yeah.
you know, forces dumping their shit all over the place. The Afghan people just threw their crap all over the place, and
Hmm.
they were modern enough to have metal, so like
Yeah.
it just went off all the time. Like a metal detector was almost useless unless you found something big, because the
Yeah.
amount of metal that they put in those IEDs was about as much as was already in the ground.
Mm.
But anyway, so in addition to learning that, they gave us these little non-conductive probes. So we're about 12 inches long. They
Mm.
looked metal, but they were not metal. They were some other non-conductive material. Um, if you know what it is, feel free to comment below. And they trained us that if we found something suspicious with the metal detector, to low crawl up to where we thought this thing was and poke it with these
Oh man,
non-metallic rods. And they trained us how to do that. Like,
sounds like a good way to get blown in half by like low crawling over a pressure plate.
after we left, an EOD tech, and I can't remember his name. I apologize. That's what happened to him. He was
Hmm.
on his belly up against an IED, investigating it, and it went off and
Mm.
killed him.
Yeah.
Rest in peace. Uh, so they trained us to do that. But I'm not an EOD tech. I'm not an engineer. I'm at 11 Bravo, just out of basic training. So they that was part of what they taught us though initially, and I think that
Hmm.
was a big failure in the Army's EOD, or not EOD but IED, counter IED training program. Was they're putting a lot of faith in people to be experts on something that there's no way that a PFC straight out of basic was going to be an expert on counter IED tactics. By the
Hmm.
end, I was, but in March of 2012, no.
Yeah.
Uh, so I remember we were on a patrol, one of our very first patrols, and I'm clearing. I'm up front, and I find a circular disc in the ground because we had been briefed, and it was a thing that there were actual still landmines in Panjwai,
Yeah.
and that the Taliban would put a landmine on top of a jug of HME to get like a double kick.
Mm.
So I had a metallic hit, I had a circular device in the ground, which is unnatural, and that's one thing that we were trained to look for. Is there's two things that are unnatural in nature: straight lines and circles.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a circle in the dirt. And so I low crawled up to this thing like I was trained to do, and I poked it. And it was about that time that my squad leader, Sergeant Bally, uh, one one of his earlier moments where he was actually not awful to me, was like, "This is fucking stupid. I'm not going to lose a guy because he's poking an IED." So he's like, "Get the fuck off that thing." And he told me to get off of it. And we bypassed it. We walked around it, called EOD. They came. This was when we still had the Air Force EOD guys. They were a little
Mm.
slow, and they showed up like an hour and a half later, and they just dragged some C4 into the middle of the field and blew it up, and it just was just a piece of plastic. It wasn't an IED.
Yeah.
But then they found one. After we found that, we went to the Adams Eye School,
Hmm.
and they found some shit there. and then they blew that up
I
too.
remember that now.
And that was before our first firefight, so that was pretty early on in the deployment.
Yeah, I remember the Adam's Eye walking in there and finding all those IEDs that were kind of scattered around that school. Yeah.
Yep.
Which, for people who weren't in the Sperwangar AO, that was a pretty popular hangout spot for the Taliban. They'd come in there to sleep at night and that kind of thing. And I kind of run out of that old abandoned school, like the ones we talked about in the first episode.
And we made a habit of going back all the time.
We did.
Like, we never went through the front door, except for that very first time we went there. Every other time we climbed over a wall and got in there. And we would find... This was the biggest shame. Like, they had nice school desks. Like, really nice school desks. And we found that they had cut up the school desks to use the wood to make pressure plates.
Yeah. I remember that now. Wow.
So that was our American taxpayer dollars at work building IEDs to blow up Americans' legs off. It was great. It's real rewarding.
Yeah. So another, in the theme of first, another significant first is when you see for the first time some real carnage. When you see somebody really get messed up. For me, it was the engineers. But like I said, I watched it all unfold from 15 meters away, so I wasn't like right up in it. But that was that was a rough one because, for obvious reasons, they both passed. But it was when I look back on it now, and I think about watching Pinnock basically kind of fade in and out of consciousness, and when he would come to, he would kind of lean up and he would omit that terrible moan. And, it was this strange feeling that I had where I knew like he was not going to make it, and like no matter how hard, and the wounds were severe. Like he had lost his legs way up next to the base of his pelvis. So there was really no room to put a tourniquet on or anything. And I just remember, once I saw him, saw his wounds and I saw his body language. And the only way I can think to describe it is, it's like you can read death on a person, and you could read it on him, and that was a terrible, terrible thing to have witnessed, and but it was kind of a foundational experience for me going forward. But I'd say the first time I really got my, really, really close up was when Clark got hit, I think, in terms of someone getting hurt.
Yeah, and I think for our squad, at least, the platoon, second squad, Sergeant Nissel's squad, they were there for the engineers. So that was their introduction. That was their crash course on human trauma. Ours was Clark. But we kind of had inklings before that. We had an ANA soldier that was killed on one of our patrols by gunfire. We had come across, I think there was the guy that got hit by the Hellfire and tried to pretend that he hadn't been hit by a Hellfire, but we knew he had. That was early on with Doc Salvador, but I think I'm trying to remember when the guy on the motorcycle that got hit by the Hellfire. That was late, yeah, but that was probably the most gruesome.
Yeah,
that was most gruesome bodily injuries I saw the entire deployment.
Yeah,
was him. Yeah, I don't have pictures of that, and we wouldn't share it if we did.
No.
But here's a video of the Hellfire strike because I don't care. I'm not in the army anymore. Army can eat. Army can fuck off. This is awesome.
And he was Taliban.
He was 100% Taliban.
They 100% knew he was a bad dude. So there's no, and everything was cool. Like it was pretty clean hit.
Oh yeah. I think it was a drone that shot him, or they said it was I don't know who fucking shot. It doesn't matter. It's cool. As someone who launched Hellfires, I'm actually pretty impressed. It's a hard target to hit. So it probably was a drone because they have better targeting systems than we did in the Apache, and which is pretty sad.
Yeah, that was definitely the most gruesome scene that I ever saw, I think.
These injuries that we came across, we had to see them for the first time at some point. And we had to see the worst of them and the best of them. Like Boyce's $1 million wound that barely bled, just this little hole that went into him, and it was a miracle what happened to Boyce.
Yeah.
To have a bullet enter your pelvis with no exit wound and no major bleeding. Like,
Hmm.
he's probably the luckiest gunshot victim ever. And he is, I'm sure he has pains and stuff, but it didn't affect his life.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Like these wounds vary so much depending on the particularities of the situation. It's just like even IED strikes are gonna be different on different people. Like they're gonna just how the concussion works and the angle of their body or whatever. So it's just like Clark mangled his hand as well as his leg.
Yeah, and that's a interesting factor too. Is all the guys that lost like one leg, the leg that wasn't ripped off was just mangled, just
Yeah.
absolutely shattered, and that really complicated their recovery actually. Um, to the point where like Dennison, who lost both of his legs, recovered faster than Clark did with just one leg,
Hmm.
because that good leg, because it had been shattered, and then when they set it, it just never sets perfect. So
Yeah.
you get these little bone spurs that grow out from the fractures and like stuff, and the pieces of your when the pieces of the bone pop off from the main bone, there's little tiny fragments in your flesh, and the bone tries to like reconnect to those pieces.
Mm.
So you look at an X-ray of these guys, and it looks like a pineapple, where you have like the bone is trying to reconnect to those fragments in the flesh, and it is incredibly painful
Mm.
uh, for life. And Clark had to have many surgeries where they had to go in and surgically remove those or file them down. Like, the injury, the amputation was not the end of a lot of these guys' you know recovery.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. It's just like we talked about, a few feet making a difference. Injuries, they vary so much depending on what it is and where it is, and the volume, and the size. IEDs, the game was always size. Is it 3 pounds or is it 20? You know, and that's going to completely change the game for what to expect out of that situation.
Yeah, I mean, you step on a 3 pound IED, you're going to be above the ankle amputee.
Yeah,
You step on a 20 pound IED, you're a double amputee at
yeah,
at least.
at best,
Yeah,
really.
yeah, yeah.
More likely you won't make it.
Yeah, and like you said, it depends on how you do it. Like, Todd,
Hmm.
when he stepped on his IED, it low ordered, I think, a little, but also he was in full sprint when he hit it.
Yeah,
So
right.
he wasn't directly over top of that explosion when it went off, because he was already halfway past it by the time it connected.
Hmm.
And yeah, as a result, his foot was not as severely wounded as it could have been.
Yeah,
And uh, yeah, so I mean, it just varies so much. And but the nice thing is, uh, combat wounds are fairly consistent. So they did really, I thought we got really good training on how to treat
we did.
people.
Yeah.
Because you can really narrow it down. I mean, mostly it's you're throwing a tourniquet on, you're packing a wound, and you're wrapping it.
Hmm.
Um, it's
ABC.
yeah, yeah, and fortunately for our squad, we never had to deal with any kind of like chest punctures or bullet
Yeah.
wounds that were untreatable. Other platoons, they did. They had to deal with that. Both the dog handler and Corporal Luxmore had gunshot wounds that were very difficult to treat, and they lost their lives, unfortunately. Um, but for the most part, we had 29 Purple Hearts from our company on that deployment, and all but like 3 of them were very simple to treat. Pack, wrap, get them on a bird. And 30 years ago, the training and the materials weren't there for that to be so quick.
Yeah. No, and the infrastructure for medevacs and stuff too. Would have been a different game because we were a 20-minute flight from CAF. Now getting somebody to an HLZ is a wholly totally different situation. But yeah, so
And we weren't trained like medics. We didn't. I'm not saying our training was phenomenal, but for the kind of wounds that we
yeah,
anticipated to experience, I thought our training for that was excellent.
Yeah, I mean, you get I mean, stop the bleeding, you know. And like we were fortunate in that by the time we deployed, they had figured out that people could have tourniquets on for long periods of time. So this myth of not being able to wear it for so long, people could have it on for hours and hours before they ran the risk of losing a limb. So because of that, you know, the guys would be at calf, and they were able to keep body parts.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, and huge shout out to the pilots and flight medics that flew for dust off. I mean, Apache pilot. We've got a running rivalry with the Black Hawk guys because we're better than them. Just kidding, guys. But in all seriousness, like what the medevac crews do is just so beyond impressive, and the risks that they take with their lives and their aircraft to get some Joe 11 Bravo to Kandahar inside the golden hour is just incredible.
It's like landing. A lot of the time those guys would land under fire in a really small HLC that make you butt pucker just watching them come in. It's like landing a beer can at a shooting range. This is a bullet magnet, and they're not armored or anything, so it takes some balls to get in there and do that, especially knowing that you're not going to be shooting back and everything like that. You're getting dudes and running.
Yeah, they have no crew serve weapons. They are not, because they wear that red cross. They can't have crew serve weapons. They're staffed by medics and a flight engineer. Like, they don't have a way to defend themselves. We are there to defend them. So
Yeah.
I have immense and no medevac pilot from 2012. I don't care if he flew us out or not. Is ever going to pay for his own drinks around me. Period.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
when I find the ones that lifted our guys out there, like, it's on.
For sure. The ones who got a Koa and that A&A guy off of the deck, that was
Yeah.
some impressive stuff right there.
Yeah. Kind of continuing along with this theme of carnage and destruction or whatever. I mean, do you remember what would have been your scariest moment on that deployment?
In vivid detail.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the things that happens, it's just going to happen because you're in combat, you're going to have these close calls,
Sure. Yeah.
And the close calls, I think scariest and like the immediate visceral experience of that moment is probably the scariest for me, this particular one. And I had a handful of pretty solid close calls, the bullets whizzing by, or I had bullets walk up the armor on a truck while I was trying to take a piss off the side of the MRAP. And little instances like that. That first firefight, even though I didn't know any better at the time, was a close one. But for me, I had a really, really bad close ambush. It was Lieutenant Kohler's first firefight, or our platoon, or our squad that was out there, which is already a really small element of maybe, there might have been 10 of us, maybe, including the ALP. So we got split up, and you guys pushed north, and you guys got into a really close and thick one. So the back element was actually pulling security for you guys to make a maneuver so you can move on these Taliban that they had eyes on with ISR. And so I was standing up. It was during my brief tenure as a saw gunner, which I loathed. But so I was standing up on this wall, fully exposed to my six, with my saw gun, or my saw up, pulling security for y'all on this Grapehut. And right behind me was kind of an open field, and there was a mud wall that was probably about no more than 15 meters. It was probably more like 10 meters, so super close. And this dude laid a PKM up on that wall and opened up on us in that corner of that little field. And then a guy down at Grape Row opened up on us with an AK. And so I went from just pulling security to getting hit to my 6 o'clock from 10 meters away. And the bullets were, snapping all around me on the walls, and the tree branches are getting shot off and falling down. And so I just spun around and I hit the prone, and I could see that dust from the muzzle flash of that PKM. And so I just opened up with that saw and held the trigger down till that, 50 round drum magazine was empty. And he swapped rounds with me, and we swapped them back and forth. And one round hit so close when I was in the prone. It hit so close to my face that it actually kicked dirt up onto my face. And I flinched even as I was pulling the trigger. I flinched from that dirt kicking up, and I could, it was probably less than a foot away from my face, probably about 8 or 9 inches. And, of course, in the moment, the adrenaline's running. We finally, we got everything kind of taken care of, got your heat cat out of the way. And which we'll go into detail with Kohler, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure he's got lots to say about that.
Yeah, but as we were walking back to the trucks, we finally got back in the trucks, and the relative safety of the trucks kind of like created this weird space for me, where all the adrenaline was gone, and all the immediacy and the need of the moment was gone, and I just had like a rush of fear.
Oh
Yeah. And I was so scared, because I realized how close I had come to getting killed. And I took my helmet off and just sit there and like cried, a hard cry for about 30 seconds. And just because I realized I had almost, like, literally inches. And I don't know how, because that dude, this is not an exaggeration, I would say that dude probably dumped almost 100 rounds on us. He must have had a big healthy drum mag full. But yeah, that was the scariest moment for me because of how close I came to, like, knowing how close I came to getting killed. I don't know how. It was just a miracle, I guess, that one of those bullets didn't land in my body somewhere.
Well, I think a lot of those experiences, like, yeah, they're scary in the moment for sure, but sometimes they're scarier like 5 minutes later, and you're like, you finally have a moment to like recollect. You're like, holy shit.
Well, in the moment, I was just fighting. I was just fighting just to go bash and firefight, and on the Exfil out of there, we were so, that ambush was so tight and so close that all of us were super on edge, and we were a small element, so I wasn't able to sit there and think about it. We just pushed and bounded back to the trucks, and finally got back to the trucks. But yeah, then the fear of the moment was like a delayed fear.
Yeah,
this
for sure.
And that really sunk into me. And when I got back into the trucks, it was tough. So yeah, what about you, man? Hitting a IED with the truck?
No, because I mean,
That
for
was
one, that was
relatively-
really early on.
Mhm.
I just thought it was hilarious. I still think it's hilarious. Like, we hit that sucker, blew our truck up. Our truck didn't have AC before, and then we got a brand new truck 6 hours later, had AC, so
But then you
okay
blew
with
that
it.
truck up.
No, it took us a couple months to blow that truck up.
Oh, okay. I couldn't remember how so close those IEDs were together.
No, they're a couple months apart. And then, we're smoking cigars after the first. I smoked a cigar after every IED hit, but yeah, we're sitting in the middle of a riverbed in our totaled MATV. I mean, it's devastated. It is in pieces. So it's probably a good 50 to 150 pound IED. I don't know exactly. It wasn't big enough to kill us, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But doors blown open, waiting on EOD to clear us so we can even get out of the truck. We couldn't even get out. We had to sit there, just in case there were secondaries.
Sure.
If we're just doors off, smoking cigars, blasting music.
Happy to be alive.
Happy to be alive. So that one wasn't too scary, although the pictures are a little scary to look at. No, by far the scariest moment was when I took 2 to 3 rounds to my rucksack during the battle in Jot, or throat chop, or whatever you want to call it. And it wasn't terrifying in the moment. Like, I knew we were getting shot at. There were 4 of us in an alley, and kind of like with your story, they had us dead to rights. And, it was only 4 Americans in an alley. They had a fatal funnel. They clearly had set it up, waiting to get as many Americans as they could in that one spot.
Mm-hmm.
And they're bouncing around, they're pinging, they're zipping. Like, I can feel the air being displaced in that, because it's a very narrow corridor. So a bunch of bullets going down that corridor. I'm feeling it. I know they're close, but at the moment it's like, we got to get out of here. Like, so I just turned, and right before that, like, PFC Tallman was in front of me, and he just dropped like a rock. And I was like, nah, he's dead. Like, I'm not going to go chasing after him. Like, we'll get him here in a second once we get fire superiority.
Mm-hmm.
So I just pushed Roberts and Robbins, I think, into an alley, which was stupid because it was an unclear alley. That was dumb on my part, but I wasn't going to stand there and get shot either. Yeah. So pushed them in there, I just turned and kind of guided them in there, went in there, and then that's when Robbins was like, "Hey man, are you okay?" I was like, "Yeah man, I'm good." "Why?" He's like, "You got shot." I was like, "No, I didn't." It's like, "I'm fine." And then I'm feeling just to make sure, and then I feel something wet, and I just like immediate panic, just like
Yeah.
that was the scariest moment when I felt that, and it was water coming out of my camelback, which had been shot. And to give like a viewers of idea of how close that was, we wear like us, our body armor, our camelback, and then our backpack. So for it to shoot, I mean, it shot through the camelback sideways. So you're talking an inch to the left, and it's in my spine. And then in addition to hitting that, it's like 2 rounds went in my backpack, and just missed. Oh, I don't know, C4, a claymore, some 40 millimeter grenades,
Yeah.
any number of things that could have exploded. So I had a little bit of a moment after that. Like they made me take all my clothes off when we got into a compound, make sure I really wasn't shot, that it wasn't just adrenaline that made me think I hadn't been shot. And then I looked at all this stuff that had bullet holes in it, and that's when the fear really set in. I was like, I can't do this anymore. I'm done. And I almost quit like 30 minutes later. Like, well, I didn't because we're in the middle of a gunfight, but mentally I quit. We're pinned down in a marijuana field. I can't shoot back because I'm surrounded by marijuana and Americans. I can't shoot blindly. I'm going to end up shooting, Tom Evans at the front on accident. So and now I feel helpless because I can't do anything. I can't protect myself. I just survived getting shot at in that alley, and I was just like, that's it. I'm done. They can shoot me. I'm just going to stay here. And I bounced back, obviously, but that's when the fear was the most severe for me on the deployment.
Yeah, man. And I think it's weird. It's not weird. It's actually perfectly usual that pretty much everybody has a story like that,
Yeah.
you know?
Oh, yeah.
And, Curtis and I have talked a lot about how we can't believe that we didn't take more casualties because everybody has close calls, like real close call stories, like similar to the ones we did. And those are just our worst close calls. But, we can both talk about moments when you've heard bullets fly over your head, or they've smacked around the walls around you, or you stepped around an IED instead of on an IED or whatever. And, and everybody has multiple incidences like that. Like Nance, and what came to be known as Vietnam Day. I mean, he was pinned down in a little divot ditch. Bally was in a very similar situation at Throat Chop, the first day of Throat Chop. He got caught in the open. It's just completely, and it was close too. That guy was probably 15 meters away, 20 meters.
Yeah, and it was just the nature of that environment, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because for one, I think you mentioned earlier in this episode, the last one, we always had more guns, always. Yeah. They might have had the tactical advantage, but we were always outgunned them.
Mm-hmm.
So that meant that if they were going to get us, they had to set up a good ambush position, and
Mm-hmm.
they had to be lucky. And they weren't amazing infantry fighters. They were good at protecting their homeland. They knew the area and they knew how to fight, but they weren't like tactically adept people.
Yeah.
So they weren't very good at setting up ambushes, at least on us. I'm sure that they were much better in some areas, and I know some guys from before and after us in Panjwai and Zare would disagree with us, and they got in some bad spots. This is just based on our experience.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't very good at setting us into ambushes. So that leaves it to luck. They had to get lucky. And, the couple times they were lucky and they were able to get American casualties. But I feel like they had a very small time frame to make an effect on us or to hurt an American. Because as soon as we could turn our guns and shoot, we took the advantage back.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
And then we'd get their heads down for 5 to 10 minutes and we had birds on station.
Mm-hmm.
And then it really was over for them. So they had a very small moment in time. So yes, we were lucky, but I think it's also because they just weren't lucky enough.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, the nature of our firefights for the most part. It was just like these really quick little skirmishes that would only last a few seconds. The longer ones, maybe a couple minutes, where they would duck and run down and pop up and fire again from somewhere else, and you'd kind of have an exchange. But I mean, really, me personally, I can only think of, right off the top of my head, 2 or 3 times, including that one that, my scariest moment I just shared, where it felt like a proper ambush. And it was mostly because of our tactics and the way we maneuvered. Like we didn't take similar routes. We changed up how we infiltrated in the areas a lot. But it also has to do with the fact that, and we started leaving at 11 o'clock at night, so we would be there at 4 o'clock in the morning when they were all still sleeping. So
And a lot of our contact too was, it would be brief, 2 or 3 minutes, but it'd be brief contact, strong exchange gunfire, birds on station, quiets down. And when if there's no contact, the birds have to leave. They have other
yep,
places that they can help, and then they leave, and it starts back up. Um, so these firefights in our minds were going on for hours, even if they were only for 5-10 minutes at a time, every 45 minutes.
yeah, yeah, that's true. It was yeah, it was almost like clockwork. Usually about 10 minutes after the birds went off station, you could pretty much expect to take contact again, and it was
Yeah,
like this game of just back and forth until either the mission was done or they decided to give up and go home, and or we hightailed it out of there or whatever.
yeah. I mean, and it's weird that I don't call my time using the mine detector as my scariest moment. And some of those were, but it's just hard to compare to that
Yeah,
to that one.
yeah, for sure. Well, I feel like when you're using the mine sweeper stuff, like sometimes you don't know how many IEDs did you step over, or did you step past? That's something I
Yeah.
try not to think too much about.
Well, especially since the answer is double digits for sure.
hmm
Because another aspect of the IEDs, and this is really important for the listeners to understand too, is they weren't always active.
Yeah.
IED, just like your garage door opener, it's battery powered. So you take the batteries out of your garage door opener, it doesn't work.
hmm
So they would take the batteries out, so that they could open up those roads and stuff for civilians or for their own use. And then they would run and they'd connect the battery when we were coming into town. So those IEDs were in the ground all the time. It's not like they were placing them there for us. They were just always there. And if it looked like we might walk towards one, they'd activate it, or they'd activate them around their strongholds or whatever. So the likelihood that we stepped over dozens of not activated IEDs is almost a guarantee. So, I guess it's time to close this one out. Um,
Yeah, for sure.
and if anything, all we've really illustrated in the last 30 minutes is that there's a lot that you and I still have to talk about, but we're gonna have many, many guests on, and we'll have
Yeah.
opportunities to kind of share some of our insights in our conversations with them. So, uh, we really look forward to sharing our insights, and the insights of our guests in the next run, however long this thing goes. And we just want to really say again to our listeners, these are our experiences. This is what we experienced, and our listeners may have experienced something different, or they may have interpreted things different, and that's fine. This is our story, and this is and we hope it resonates with as many people as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And like Curtis said, this is just our part. And we hope that by the end of this thing, there's a nice web of a narrative to overlay on this experience that provides a lot more in depth and more well rounded understanding of all this stuff, because obviously our perspectives are limited. You know, if I'm safely tucked away behind a wall, but Curtis is getting shot in the backpack, then our experience at that moment is going to be different. So, across everybody that we interview, we're going to be able to weave these experiences into a more solid fabric, if you will, that's going to more readily demonstrate the deployment to a lot better capacity than you and I have.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I apologize in advance to our listeners. You're going to hear the same stories many times
Yeah.
from many different points of view, and we may even rehash our parts of that story from time to time. But the entire goal of this project was to tell the whole story, and
Yeah.
that means from different points of view. Um, so an interesting thing that I kind of hope comes out of this is that even the people that we talk to get a better understanding of their own experiences. Because
Yeah.
I know I have in talking to people,
Hmm.
seeing, Luke's point of view of the same exact firefight that I was in, or Matthew Kohler's point of view of the same exact firefight that I was in. And just that little different angle has made my understanding of my own experiences better.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. It's rung true for me as well.
So, next time on the Panjwai podcast, we're going to have former captain Matthew Kohler, who was our platoon leader in the second half of our deployment in 2012. And I think you guys will really enjoy our conversation with Matt, and I think it'll be one to tune into. So make sure you set your reminder and hit subscribe, like, and download the episodes as they come out.